Even before I lobbied my way into the IEC, I had been privy to the most wide variety of scholarly letters arriving at Connaught by automatic syndication. Not that one needed such information to know of the blast that started all this. American survivors were causing a nuisance everywhere. No, the real catastrophe of our age could be found in those scientific journals, enjoying repeated mention for several months as mathematical theories buckled under the downward trend of instrumental records. In a time of war, these concerns did not pierce the veil, and I shouldn't have read them if not searching for any excuse to leave the manor again. I wagered my husband would trust a scientific venture to not be too devious to deny me. This state of readiness had me among the first to read the direr warnings, and I suppose the first to dismiss them. What fortune it is for the Empire that greater minds insist on following their instruments to pits of horror reserved for the more sobering of sermons. It was only 1 month before I left Connaught that serious consideration to the end of days was writ in Hansard. I was ready for it by then, I thought. Not a cause for bother. Rather, a superb bit of exercise to do something about it. Then, thank God for the greed of the IEC, already pouncing upon the bounties of mineral surveying on Greenland's coast, and indeed eager for a seasoned touch of class in their filthy operations. I wish someone else had tried to save the world, but the Royal Society steers us all into their embrace, and all inexorably to a strip of paper promising riches immortal upon the completion of a simple 6-week contract. Yes, we were all supposed to die. Their certainty did not belie the fate of our world. It was now passed to me to not belie it also, and indeed to not falter in my task to provide refuge in the time of revelation. Somewhere, out there beyond the steamy glass beside me, the world was crumbling to white dust. Fool that I was, it was now my problem. I slept briefly, woken again by the telegraphy machine's whinnying. It reported that 5 more commissioned men were departing to lend us aid, along with their petty collection of hands. That these were the last mouths to be transferred was beyond thinking. If all was not well at home, even the IEC board were likely to make their excuses and come grovelling to me in this den of rumoured refuge. It brought to mind a recent idea: shelves to stow the hands in the tents. We needed to prepare as much accommodation under our canvas as possible, if only to keep the associated squalor contained to the extremities of the site. Before the unpacking work at the landings commenced, I went over to rouse the hands in person, flanked by the usual entourage. An unusually coarse use of my time, yet I had to say something of the developments abroad. A small untruth here could steer us clear of a great deal of upset. I told them that their pay had been summarily doubled on account of new interest from the Royal Society, but that in exchange I was regretfully asking them to allow the carpenters to raise their beds upon shelves. As predicted, the former comment obscured the processing of the latter, and to think the IEC was promising an order of magnitude more than that. It's a mere flash of coin that moves hands by the flock, especially in colonies. More wisdom of the Connaught dynasty passing clear test and proving indispensable. I departed while spirits were buoyed and took up the post at my high window. The ships returned twice during the day with plenty more material for our vital mission. The work in the camp was completed, and the hunters provided more than enough spoil for that day and the next, contributing to a rather positive and near-festive mood. Oh, how the troubles must have seemed to be more sleeps away than the hands could bring themselves to count. They were engaging with each other in ludities in the depths of their camp, a business already presumed to be taking place whenever they were out of our sight, only now it was becoming rather loud in several senses. That such actions were occurring was being communicated loudly in the local environs by its very nature, which was then prompting secondary reporting of the disturbing nighttime chirping to me. I had a few self-appointed experts among the engineers who presented in unison a case that this unsanitary, immoral and rotten behaviour be abolished. I wittily returned that to abolish the base sins was to abolish not only the driving force invigorating our hands, but to step in and try to blind God to the real shade of their worth. There was a kind of denial on this topic, in which those who wished to see a machine that did not require unsavory inputs dreamed a lifelike world in which we already had such an impossible machine installed. I dismissed it all with the practical conclusion that we had a more vital machine to design, leaving no spare moment to mould the throngs into anything but their natural slouch. Furthermore, I found the entire subject to be intriguing. We arranged to provide the hand camp with a rudimentary public house aside from the main huddle, in which all manner of sin could be concealed after the contracted hours of work. Seeing my interest through, I took it upon myself to ensure its effects were at their maximum. I inspected the female contingent of the camp, and found 3 or 4 that would suit the work of comforters. One knew the trade well, so I appointed her the matron of the establishment. There was complaint at the specifics of my selection and its involuntary nature, despite the hypocrisy of these hands being so desperate to volunteer for any work the IEC could give them. I think a cushy indoor position was something of a promotion, especially for those girls whose youth was being sapped by the daily labour. I imagine they were quite excited, really. On the morning of the 7th day, we received our second clue about the goings-on in the wider world. A week is a long stretch to miss amid global revelation. It was a letter supplied with the fresh hands from Liverpool, directed at one of my engineers. Naturally, all letters visited my desk before their final leg, by company policy and my rightful curiosity. This one bore a tale from India of anguish and bloody flight. It was falling apart, the empire, nay, the world. The writer's family had returned to England to escape the chaos. What a disappointment that must have been. India will be far better off in times like these, once the mongrels themselves have perished. But alas, it is supposedly the fruit of our deep pit that promises to keep Liverpool alive, not the brilliant warmth of hard-fought colonies. Those would be reserved for, well, the likes of me, were I not crawling to adventure with insectoid ignorance. Anyway, I destroyed the letter, and our pantomime of paying work carried on. Our newest hands were sea folk, still with the colour in their faces after the crossing. Sil recognised their talent at once, and recommended we have them harvest the coastal waters. It was a vital recommendation, given our tenuous position. Supposedly there was no food on the other end of our shuttle ships to bring. What we did have was a coast strewn with wrecks, big and small, the litter of previous ventures to these bottom-of-the-barrel colony sites. Therefore, acquiring small craft in partially working order was no harder than walking Jasper below the Moody Cliffs for an afternoon, 10 hands in train. Penn's special broth was set to be improved dramatically, which raised spirits among all that lived in our dire club. Once determined that we had a certain level of self-sufficiency established by the bounty of the sea, I finally turned my schedule book to the pit. There was a great deal to achieve in its bowels. Its location was the secret. Below were sites of shallow volcanism, hot rocks that turned the gentle drizzle to steam. The main thrust of the plan was to combine this natural heat with the stored fires of coal stones to create a machine bursting with primordial energy. The generator, it was named. At the core of what was to remain of civilization, it was to generate the very will of life, or failing that, large and dramatic explosions. The designs, unfamiliar to me, were assuredly experimental, yet there was no such thing as risk when all was said to be doomed elsewise. Therefore the hands went down with ropes and pieces of scaffold to be thralls to the over-passionate engineers at the rim. By the schedule we had drawn up, we were likely to complete our work in good time, a few weeks, although with less and less of an empire to return to, this was ultimately a secondary concern. Pride aside, we had what you might call pedigree hands, if such a thing can exist, so I expected pleasant surprises in the evening reports. Indeed, the best surprise is one you expect. However, our friendly pit managed to spoil the rich pedigree of the labour with its foul secretions, much as said labour would do unto itself if left unblinkered. I speak of the gas that leaked up from the bubbling rock far below, fleeing for the sky, but happy to stop off in the cramped lungs of a common labourer. This, according to their own reports, caused a loss of the mind's acumen and a sickness in the stomach. We had several doctors at the headquarters who regretfully reported that there was some material evidence of these complaints. The pit was seeping poison from the underworld. Even the most mechanical of individuals shuddered at this omen. The hands were none too happy with it. Neither was I. You see, a sick hand does little and eats a lot, and tends to take up more space than a healthy specimen besides. I couldn't do with this gas delaying work, and had to know where to draw the line. I devised an experiment. Each hand was provided a number, written on a band on both ankles, both wrists, and largest on a sash about the neck. I created a new book that would record in detail the location and duration of each number's work in the pit, linked to 2 rows of hourly symptom reports from the doctors. In time, I would establish precisely the limits of the hand's endurance, and hence what length of work done made sense to gamble against a given length of work missed when overcome by the gas. It was something for me to do other than steam up my window, and it had a joyous side effect. We could all forego the names of the hands, since the numbers were printed clearly there for all to utilize. I imagine the hands still used each other's names in private, as they were proud of them in a strange way. Unlikely they would realize how much easier a numerical system is. Science brings us closer to God, where name and number alike are shed, and spirit outshines all. The pit must have been aglow with spirit, as the menace of hell deterred our enterprise not. Fresh arrivals came in with the ships, along with coal and steel for our industry. I doubled the number of fishermen and hunters we had in anticipation of further supply draw to come, yet I did so apparently in error, as revealed by a review of our company on the morning of our 10th day. We numbered 120, fewer than I had previously calculated. 25 were engineers, 2 counts for Jasper and I, and then the rest were the hands. Therein was the discrepancy, revealed quickly in the doctor's addition to the safety logs. 7 hands were dead already, a far greater rate of attrition than any of us had imagined. We had to reel in the boundary of the gaswork experiment to something much more modest. Foul business. We'd be late at the rate we settled upon, and the promised evacuees would surely be heartbroken to find us still in Congress with our own metalwork as the cold set in. And as we all well know, death is not the only state of being to which a hand can be lost. There is the dreaded insubordination, worse than death sometimes. I suspect I fell victim to this on that same day. One of our 2 hunting parties failed to check in at noon, and the airwaves were silent in response to our telegraphy calls. While not cause for special concern in the moment, it was in fact the worst case scenario. They were rogue, with weapons, supplies, and 15 pairs of bloody hands. That made 25 lost so far, if one counts the 3 lost overboard on the outward voyage. Quite frustrating. At every junction bound for a standard sort of affair, the drama of the age heightened, in all cases traceable to some weakness of our supposedly elite hands. The best they could be was not enough, it seemed. You should have seen the fuss they made the next day as they carried their coffins to the docks. This was during the 11th hour, their tools lying wasted on the ground around the pit. Penn and Sill both considered it acceptable, so I hesitated to intervene. After the painfully turgid procession, the buggers did not even return straight to their work. In their deathly moods, I fear that the mildest portents seemed overwhelming, and hence when they sighted an owl taking stock of their camp, they were lost into fits of peril and despair. It was a mummer's farce if ever there was one, hoping their half-day of tears might earn them an afternoon in the lounge. They perked up a little when I fired my revolver into the air at their camp's boundary. The owl made its quick way off, clearly with far more sense and schedule than my soup of orphans. They were too cowed to look at me, although they already knew what my smoking barrel was waving them to. However, to make matters worse, as I returned to headquarters I was met by a better groomed gaggle, the engineers. They had been privately drawing a mathematical model of the patterns in gas pressure at the lowest fissures. It was, ironically, devilishly clever. It was the results I took issue with. They concluded that not only had the volume of toxic smoke pouring in the pit grown, but its rate of release was oscillating up and down. We were in the process of ascent, meaning that our problems were quite likely to get worse before they returned to the steady sailing of a mere 7 casualties per day regime. So I instructed the hands to get on with the work, and instructed the engineers to keep those hands alive by hook or by crook. Fortunately, with only scraps of the day remaining, we had only a few respiratory issues to treat come nightfall. Our doctors, 5 in all, seemed to find the time to make a stop off at the saloon we'd granted the hands. Despite my desire and right to know what precisely they were doing in there, I did not ask when they came to report of their venture. They were adamant that my selected publican girls were quite at risk of venereal disease, which in turn could spread widely by the nature of their professional associations. 2 thought perhaps the whole practice should be barred. 2 more wished to have anyone in the camp with symptoms shipped off with the coffins, and the final one was eager to conduct inspections for said symptoms with clockwork regularity. While I rather considered the project to be my own experiment, it was likely that their expertise trumped my noble patronage, so I obliged them to sanitize the operation, so long as its carrying on was not affected. That den of sin was a wheel of industry as sturdy as any other, I proclaimed, although I was not yet sure of it. In truth, it was a futile effort. The hands, although surely motivated by these sanctioned pleasures, were more easily steered off course than God's plan required. That afternoon there was audible complaint from the pit, which turned out to be some further nonsense about owls. It was quite remarkable though. There were many owls now perching here and there about the site, peering at us with their stoic wit. They must have deduced that all the rats in the land were converging on our squalid waste piles. It was more than I'd ever seen, and Connaught had its fair share. The hands were aghast and appalled at the judgment these mighty birds passed. While I'd read the Bible thoroughly, I must have missed the part in which the order of revelation would be communicated through the presence of owls, which was precisely the claim coming from the pit. Doom and gloom. I was ready to write it off as a side effect of the strange airs from below. However, a dastardly coincidence set this sadness in a binding contract. An explosion. We all felt it. It was below, in the depths of the pit, where tunnels fanned out to make channels for more heat. Another property of the abyssal rocks was that some were liable to excite when flame was applied. Such was the cause of a blast, trapping a gang in the dark down there. Doesn't bear imagining. At once there was a hatched plan to counterblast, reopening the passage, although such an operation required the removal of parts of the heavy scaffolds already in place, and with time of the essence, the blast itself would have to do the removal. I rushed back to the headquarters with 3 engineers and arranged them around a table. We had the designs unfurled, and I had them calculate the rough measure of the structure that would have to be remade if this further blast was sustained. Then I applied my own calculation to their results in order to determine that 600 man-hours would be required to repair the damage. Our contract there was to last another 30 days, according to the IEC's original calendar. While assuming that remained valid was folly, I'd no other metric to make the most vital part of the decision. 30 days, 10 hours per day. Every casualty taken that afternoon cost us 300 men-hours, it could be said. Therefore, the final arithmetic was simple. If more than 2 hands were trapped in that tunnel, then we'd profit from saving them. The engineers reported with a strange happiness that it was far more than 2. I forget the exact number, but of course, as I just explained, it didn't matter so much with the threshold exceeded. This ludicrous blast upon blast scheme went ahead, and destroyed both our work and the tunnel obstructions as designed. I rather think the hands were surprised by my decision, given their overjoyed reaction. They suspected I would callously let the matter pass by. Alas, simple mathematics were beyond them, and hence the ethics of it all must have seemed muddied. At least they were pleased, for about 2 hours. After that they must have started talking to those extracted from the dark, who themselves likely took time to voice their overall displeasure at the experience. This was communicated so well that it spread as if the entire company had been trapped in that hole. It was silly, really. yet impossible to ignore. The hands threw down their tools with reckless cheer. They had decided among themselves that they no longer wished to work for their salvation. It was a strike to the very heart of our species. There was no longer any doubt that the liberal attitude I had taken towards the hands was poisoning them worse than any toxic gas. I should not have buoyed their spirits with that meat breakfast stunt. They sought greater and more profitable stunts now, risking our entire kind to extract them from me. Byron would have known what to do. In fact, he would have already done it by then. I was strangely mellow at his absence, feeling very alone. I had Jasper, of course, and as ever, the happy chap provided me with a clear answer. All the hands needed was a little application of the choke chain.